All right, everybody, today we're going to finish up imperialism, at least them being imperial, and we'll get to legacies another day. Super. But today, one, will be a lot shorter, and two, let's talk about all the other areas in Europe, what they were doing, because, we should probably figure that out too. And the Europeans who were following the British. Of course, the British set the tone, and they were the ones out there, and they were the ones dominating everybody. And one of the areas that a lot of other people could get into was Asia. As you can see, the British, aside from, here's like the real British big hold down, but all this kind of stuff, was available. Now, when a lot of these European nations got over to Asia, they had a variety of different problems. One was disease, again, shocker. But the other one was actually trying to figure out who to deal with to start to get a foothold. In many of these Asian areas, particularly in Indonesia, and then as you see there, Siam and other areas in like modern day Thailand, is that in some of these places, women were actually in charge. And that is a little bit different, as we all well know. And so much so that the Europeans were really taken aback by it. And in many cases, in some of the areas of Thailand, again, which we don't really have time to discuss, men were expected to dress beautifully and wear makeup and jewelry and stuff like that, and women were really running the show. Eventually, though, instead of, trying to create relations, it was like, hey, what if we just conquer everybody? And of course, that's what happened. So, as you can see here, the Dutch will go into Indonesia, a little bit on the other side of the world in the Caribbean, but this is the Dutch stronghold big time. The French will get, this is called French Indochina in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They'll also move over into North Africa, which I'll explain there, and they'll actually stay there till the 70s. The French were also really big in trying to push Christianity where they went, which they would have a certain degree of success. This, of course, being the United States over here. And then you'll also get the Germans start to try to kind of steam their way over here. Don't do a lot here. We'll do a lot more in Africa. But now the big move is on. And the other big place is Africa. And Africa was known to have massive resources. Of course, it has massive resources today. But prior to this, there are some unknowns and some things that are helping Africa that we have alluded to a little bit before. The unknowns were really the inside. No European for thousands of years, which we'll kind of get into later, had really been to this area kind of ever. So people knew about the coast, but they didn't know about inside. And the things that really helped Africa, which we talked about, were one, disease, malaria killed Europeans like a job, as well as the lack of technology to navigate rivers. They didn't have a lot of good harbors. You have escarpments and mountains in the middle that are tough to figure out. But eventually, the key guy that is going to help to break all this down will be Dr. David Livingstone, as you see him there on the bottom left. And on the right would be his journeys through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s until eventually he actually dies right there in the middle in Chitambo on May 1st, 1873. But Livingstone's journey was crucial. He actually went in there, and at some point people thought he died. Now, he wasn't the nicest of guys. He definitely believed that the Europeans were superior to the Africans. He will travel over 4,300 miles. When he returns, he has a huge basically this book of all of the stuff that he came across. He made some positive contacts with tribal groups that welcome the British in initially, and we all know how that's going to get up, but also really showing the resources, places like Victoria Falls, and the Europeans come running. And they come running so much that they start to get into each other's space. And the Europeans, we all well know, when they start to kind of bang against each other, wars shortly follow. So in a remarkable sense of clarity, and this almost never happens in Europe, they will have the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. And the purpose of this conference was to bring together Germany, the Netherlands, England, France, Belgium, Spain, and Italy, and Portugal to sit down and divide up Africa. Now, there were actually other issues, many of them economic, that were discussed here. We'll get to those later. But really, the idea was how they were going to figure out who gets what area in Africa. Okay, and as you see on the map there on the right, it was divided up accordingly. Also, to talk about the ideas of bringing in settlers, which was very, very interesting. And once again, using businessmen to lead the way, which then after that, they would establish colonial governors that would get tax collection, resource organization, and they'll start to remove the kings that were down there. And in general, it was remarkably successful, except for one area that I like to mention. That is our friends in Ethiopia. As you can see there, Ethiopia was surrounded by other foreign areas. Now you have a couple areas here out in the west, Liberia, which was really kind of nominally, not really subject to the United States, but just a few people. And a couple areas there, they really weren't independent. Ethiopia was really the true independent nation. Now their area was given to the Italians, but they are able to basically beat the Italians senseless when they come in. The most famous was the Battle of Adowa, and here is the depiction of that. The Ethiopians on the left, and note they have guns. Ethiopians had traded for years. Remember, the Ethiopians were Christian, so that made them a little bit different. They had that trade for years and years that the rest of Africa did not, and they flat out beat the Italians down and will hold them out really until the 1930s. And the only reason the Italians will ever actually conquer them is they had help from the Nazis. So great job, Ethiopia. Now, the imperial impact on Africa would really be devastating. I mean, I give some positives. You did have the expansion of religion, and we can say missionaries did a lot of really good work here and continue to do good work here. Whether they're Muslim missionaries, whether they're Christian missionaries, they really have accomplished some incredible things in Africa, as well as eventually leading to groups of charitable organizations or things like the Peace Corps. And in many of at least the outside areas, they will do a lot so that they can build the infrastructure and roads. However, in the end, it's so they can take all the resources out. But in the long run, it's the negatives. And many of you who have had world cultures know about this, and those of you who had not, you will get this. Europe basically wrecks Africa. Look at that picture on the right. I mean, that's where it is. You see the men in the front here. I mean, look at the look this guy's giving. This guy doesn't even want to look at the camera, and this little kid's like, oh, yeah, it's great. Yes, this is how people would walk around. First and foremost, they cut and divided up the boundaries. They ignored traditional tribal lands. And the big thing that they did is, you really see the impact today, is that they would put tribal groups that traditionally had not gotten along or were enemies and jam them all into one country. Now, the Europeans were able to keep control of them, violently so. However, in the end, what's going to happen is today, Africa is known for civil war upon civil war upon civil war. And one of the reasons for those civil wars was that the Europeans had set it up, that they would put these groups that don't like each other. They would then choose one group as being better and then give them stuff, which we'll get into later, which gets a lot of animosity. And then when the Europeans leave, shockingly enough, you have civil wars. And they built all that infrastructure to take all their stuff. It's just brutal. In the end, most of it is kept in line through violence. And that leads us to the biggest, probably the most negative case study you could get in Africa, which would be what Belgium did. Now, Belgium, you're like, Belgium? Belgium's not bad. No, check this out. So in Belgium, they will take over the Congo, which today, by the way, has incredible amounts of wealth. They have incredible amounts of resources, but they're fighting wars. You can actually look at a John Green video on just the Congo, and we might do that. That was all set up by the Europeans. The Belgians come in there. They want to establish trade. It is a free trade zone for Europeans. But what you end up getting is King Leopold the First, and then Leopold II as well, will rule this area by force of violence, and they actually commit a genocide. They will work people to death. They will basically set up the plantation systems that you saw in the New World, The only reason they stopped is because the rest of Europe got on them, but they've never paid any reparations or anything like that. If you see the picture of those two boys on the right, to keep people in line, they would typically hack off one of their limbs with a machete, and they would often target children because one way that you keep parents in line is hurting their children. So yes, they would deliberately attack children. And here, guys, we don't necessarily have the spread of disease, okay? These are people that are actively being killed by the Belgians and would continue throughout most of the 1900s. Now, why would they do such a thing? Because they thought they were better. And here's a great example of that. In Belgium and some parts of Germany, they set up zoos of people. If you see these pictures here, this little girl is kept in a zoo, okay, and she's being fed food. These people, they rebuilt a village, and you can see them sitting there. They have the women actually without shirts on and whatnot, despite the fact that they're in Belgium, so it's not as warm as it is in Africa. And you see, I mean, this is no different than, I'm sure you've been to the zoo with the big glass wall and you look at the animals. This is exactly what they're doing. This picture on the right, by the way, was taken in 1958. And so when we look at the legacy of imperialism, what you can see in certain parts of Asia, but most notably in Africa, was just this devastation. And we'll be talking about this in the 20th century. And if you want to really know the situation where Africa is, and remember all these great empires we talked about, Mali and Songhai and Mansa Musa and the Aksum and the city-states of the Somali city-states, all brought down by the Europeans. All right, get your questions and comments in, and guys, we'll take a look at this tomorrow. See you.